His Excellency Sakjenda Safia, Minister attached to the Prime Minister and Secretary General for the Council for the Development of Cambodia, Mr. Koji Hachiyama, Chief Operating Officer, the Economic Research Institute for Asean and East Asia, ERIA. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. I am Jeremy Gross, the Director of Capacity Building at ERIA, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this public-private dialogue co-hosted between the Council for the Development of Cambodia and ERIA. To open this dialogue on behalf of ERIA, I would like to invite the Chief Operating Officer of ERIA, Mr. Koji Hachiyama, to deliver his opening comments. Mr. Hachiyama, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy. His Excellency Sakjenda Safia, Minister attached to the Prime Minister and Secretary General of the Council of the Development of Cambodia. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. I'm Koji Hachiyama, Chief Operating Officer of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, ERIA. And it gives me a great pleasure to be here with you this morning to deliver opening remarks for this public dialogue, public-private dialogue. Since the establishment of ERIA by the East Asian Summit in 2008, with the purpose of strengthening regional economic integration and narrowing developing gap through research and policy advice, ERIA has had a very strong and close relationship with the loyal government of Cambodia, especially the Ministry of Commerce and Economy and Finance. However, amongst the wider audience, ERIA is perhaps best known for its capacity building program that has organized and facilitated workshops and trainings for hundreds of Cambodian government officials since 2015, including many, I'm pleased to say, from Council for the Development of Cambodia. The mandate of ERIA was to carry out its work by working with the ASEAN Secretariat, ASEAN member states, and ASEAN Chair. In support of the ASEAN Chair this year, we are proud to contribute to 4 priority economic deliverables under the ASEAN Economic Community. In addition, we are supporting 13 projects under the ASEAN Social and Cultural Community. In 2012, when Cambodia was the last chair of ASEAN, we contributed to the discussion for establishment of framework for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, a significant achievement of Cambodia's 2012 chairmanship of ASEAN. Therefore, I'm especially pleased to be here with you today with RCEP now in force to discuss investment opportunities that will be created for Cambodia through your membership of RCEP. This event is special as it brings together the business community with government officials to learn and share information about RCEP and to provide platform for exchanging experience to the benefit of all. Today's dialogue, the fourth in a series of 5, focuses specifically on the investment chapter, but will also, I hope, trigger broader discussion on Cambodia's attractiveness for FDI from RCEP members and beyond. The RCEP investment chapter is widely seen as offering an opportunity to consolidate and modernize the investment liberalisation, promotion, facilitation, and protection regime applicable to the RCEP parties, many of which already had international investment agreement among themselves. As the RCEP entered into force earlier this year, and as the negotiations were mostly conducted behind cross-border, the private sector, and in particular, the investor, are only starting to understand the impact it may have on future investment decision. In this context, I'd like to commend the Royal Government of Cambodia in general and the Council for the Development of Cambodia for its efforts in updating and modernizing the country's law on investment late last year. This timely decision and Cambodia's proactive stance on implementing RCEP and making its law and regulation fit for purpose can only be lauded. We are impressed with the enthusiasm and interest shown by participants to our recent public-private dialogue on upcoming RCEP for Cambodian business organized earlier this year. With support of Australian government, whose contribution I'd like to acknowledge, ERIA's capacity building program is pleased to be able to organize events such as this. I sincerely hope that today's discussion will strengthen the investment environment in Cambodia, contributing to a stronger Cambodia that can create a more employment opportunity for all. Thank you very much for kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koji Hachiyama, Chief Operating Officer of ERIA. Now, on behalf of the Council for the Development of Cambodia, may I invite His Excellency, Sokchenda Sophia, to deliver his opening remarks. Excellency, the floor is yours.
A very good morning to all of you. Welcome to Cambodia, although it's online, but I hope that there are many participants joining us from outside of Cambodia. I thank you, Mr. Jeremy Gross, for your introduction. And at the outset, I wish to sincerely, on behalf of the management of the CDC, I wish to thank ERIA for co-organizing, co-hosting this private dialogue, this public-private dialogue. It's the fourth one, and it's about Cambodia. We are very privileged. I have looked at the program, and I was very pleased to see that in section 1, as in section 2, there will be representative of the private sector that will speak. And this is why I have immediately accepted when ERIA proposed us this dialogue. When I saw public-private dialogue, I accepted immediately. Why? As you know, the CDC is a government institution. The CDC is an IPA, Investment Promotion Agency. In order to fulfill properly our mission, I am of the view that we should engage as much as possible with the private sector. Starting in December 1999, we were at that time all very young. More than 20 years ago. In Cambodia, we have started the first government private sector forum. It's a big meeting shared by the Prime Minister himself, with all cabinet ministers attending, all governors, and over 300 representatives from the private sector. In that meeting, representatives of the private sector were raising issues that they wish the government to find solution. This mechanism that we call in short G, government private PSF, has been instrumental to create an enabling environment in Cambodia. We do have law and regulation. Legal framework is important. But more broadly, as you know, business environment is not only law. I mentioned this. It's just an encouragement for panelists this morning. Please express your views. We are here for that. We have 2 hours, and you can even drink tea or coffee. I will not touch technically, specifically on RCEP. Many friends and colleagues after me will elaborate on it. And I hope that you have done your homework. But for participants to be on a level playing field, allow me to give you some background, historical background of Cambodia. And it will explain why Cambodia is Cambodia today and why we have such and such policies. Unfortunately, you have heard, all of you have heard about our terrible past that end in theory with the signing of the peace agreement in Paris in October 1991. In July 1993, first ever election, and in October 1993, first government after 3 decades of civil war, first government, 1993. At that time, Cambodia was at ground zero. Don't talk about economic development. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have road, such and such. As early as 1994, August, we have adopted the law on investment in the Kingdom of Cambodia. At that time, it was a kind of revolution, if the word is not too strong. Our law was a single law that can be applied to both domestic investors and foreign investors. You may forget that at that time, many countries in the region were enforcing 2 different laws, one for the nationals and one for the foreign investors. This is, ladies, gentlemen, friends, to tell you that as early as 1994, we believe in openness, in liberalisation. We believe on the private sector as the engine of growth. Can you believe me that in 1994, Cambodia allowed investment in all sectors, including telecom, banking, insurance, agriculture, to foreigners? Do you know that not only those sectors were open to foreigners, but they can undertake those projects 100% without any local participation requirement. More open, more liberal than that, you couldn't find at that time. There is a reason. We were post-war country, small economy, and we want to stand up from ground zero. We have to rely, if we are to grow, if we are to create job and employment, we have to produce and export. Who are the producers? We were counting on domestic producers, but also on foreign investors. This is why our law in 1994 was so open. Please, gentlemen, come to Cambodia. Invest in Cambodia and grow with us. First point that I like to make. 1994, the law. Soon after we have this government, our endeavor, the endeavor of the government was to be a member of ASEAN. Back to 1993, only 6 ASEAN members. Later on, in 1997, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos joined. And Cambodia was the last one to join the family in December 1999. It was a strong wish to be part of ASEAN. It is our policy to be integrated into the region and into the global community. It is why after ASEAN, we work hard from 2000 to 2003 to be admitted as member of WTO. Admitted by the Working Party in July 2003, but officially at the ministerial meeting in Cancun only in 2004 after we ratified. So official membership 2004. I mentioned this. ASEAN, WTO, in order for me to tell you that Cambodia has always and will always uphold integration, regional integration, global integration, and multilateralism. Here we are. Mr. Gross may be a bit impatient. It's a long introduction, but it brings us to RCEP. It's about integration. It's about multilateralism. You see, 2 weeks ago, what happened in Geneva? Ministerial meeting, WTO, and still the system has problem. This is why we count. We, ASEAN member countries, plus 5 other partners, namely China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. We wish, despite all the horrible news that you read and I hear every day since the beginning of this year, the Ukraine war, adding to the disruption of COVID, that add to the turbulence caused by Revolution 4.0. All this is the current ambiance. And it is why it is imperative, it is important to all of us to make the implementation of RCEP officially implemented it, and its entry into force was since 1st January. Let's move. And I am very glad to reiterate, to recall that RCEP is at the origin, an initiative from ASEAN, from ASEAN countries. And as a matter of fact, expecting that we will get out from this terrible virus pandemic, ASEAN has prepared an ASEAN comprehensive recovery framework. In that recovery framework, there are 5 broad strategies. The third one deals with maximizing the potential of intra-ASEAN market and broader economic integration. This strategy, number 3, is very detailed from A to Z. And increasingly, there is a specific mention of, in this strategy, I read the signing and early entry into force of RCEP. So just to tell you that ASEAN, Cambodia as an ASEAN member, and today I'm a representative of the country that is the chair of ASEAN. ASEAN is strongly committed, both ASEAN, including Cambodia, strongly committed to make a smooth, effective implementation of RCEP. Provisions have been elaborated, documents have been signed, and I know a lot of things to read, but I urge friends from the private sector to look at it and to take advantage of it in a positive way, because there are new things, excellent things for all of us. For East Asia, more developed economies, but also for middle income countries. There are provisions that are very encouraging for the smooth implementation. You all agree with me that the common rule of origin is something that we all welcome. Apart from East Asia, many countries in ASEAN, in the region, still have small enterprise. And I'm pleased that in RCEP, there are provisions dealing with SMEs, upgrading skill such and such. I will end my long introduction, because other colleagues are impatient, by telling you that Cambodia has prepared the ground for a smooth implementation of of RCEP. Let me tell you that in 2015, we have adopted the Industrial Development Policy, IDP in short, 2015-2025, aiming at what? Diversification, more value add, higher skill. More recently, last year, we have adopted the Cambodia Digital Economy and Society Policy Framework. We know that skill, quality of human resource is an issue in Cambodia. So we have adopted the National Employment Policy 2015-2025. At the same time, we have adopted the National TVET Policy 2017-2025. Some investors, not all, still complain about energy price in Cambodia. We have adopted, or we have drafted, the National Energy Efficiency Policy 2021-2030. Last but not least, talking about RCEP, talking about integration, regional integration, we have to talk about connectivity, about better logistics. And Cambodia has prepared a master plan on intermodal connectivity and logistic system. This is in brief, not all, to tell you that on the government side, Cambodia has drawn lesson from past experience, our own past experience. We recognize, we acknowledge some weaknesses, and those policies and strategies that I have mentioned aim at improving the situation in order for the private sector to give life to AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, that we have all agreed that we wish to have a single market, a single production base. This is about AEC. And now, more broadly, we have done this homework in order to be able to implement what we have all agreed with the signing of the RCEP and the implementation since January this year. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Sokchenda Sophia, not just for the warm and kind words about ERIA, but also for sharing with us how Cambodia's own history and emphasis on regional integration can be seen through the story of investment, going back to the first investment law. And of course, regional economic integration, as Mr. Hachiyama said, is one of the principles, the directives and the mandates of ERIA, and what we hope to support. So thank you very much, and we certainly appreciate your presence for co-hosting this event with us, and we look forward to further events together. Before moving on to session one, may I also thank on behalf of ERIA all the speakers and panelists for joining us today. We very much appreciate your participation, as well, of course, to all those who have registered and are watching this event. I hope this today's discussion will be helpful to you all, and may I wish you all a fruitful discussion over the next couple of hours. Thank you. And on this, yes, Excellency.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to add something. I didn't forget, I mentioned the genesis of our investment law in 1994. But more recently, and this is what is of interest for all participants today is the new investment law that you have mentioned that have been adopted in October 2021. This law, I don't hear so far somebody complaining about it, but I didn't want to touch on it because I have a very capable colleague in session 1 who will elaborate on it. So just to tell you, we are very proud of it. I would love to talk on it because I slept on it for years, but I would give the floor to the younger generation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And of course, we look forward to the presentation by your colleague, Dr. Sasanera, during session 1. So on that, may I hand over to Mr. Sven Kallebo, who will be the moderator for today's event. Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Excellency, pay my respect. Excellency, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So for those of you who've just joined us, welcome to the public-private dialogue on unpacking the RCEP agreement for Cambodian businesses. This is number 4 in our series of 5 dialogues, following our previous dialogues on e-commerce, trading goods, rule of origin, trading services earlier this year. And if you like these events, I'm happy to tell you that our next and last event in this series will take place in July, together with the General Department of Customs and Excise, and will focus on the chapter on customs procedures and trade facilitations. Let it be known that we are also having the same series of public-private dialogue for Lao PDR. So this event is brought to you by the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, in partnership with the Council for the Development of Cambodia, in short CDC, of the Royal Government of Cambodia, and with the funding of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My name is Sven Kallebo. I'm an advisor here at the Ministry of Commerce in Cambodia and an international trade consultant for the CDP program at ERIA. I will have the pleasure to be your moderator for today. So before exploring the objective of this webinar, before exploring the agenda for this webinar, I'd like to again pay my respect to His Excellency Sokchenda Sopia, who is the minister attached to the Prime Minister, Secretary General of the Council for the Development of Cambodia, and thanking him for gracing us with his presence today, inviting as well key CDC officials, Dr. Senera, but also I see in the room a lot of CDC officials, and also for spearheading Cambodia's investments in development for the past 2.5 decades. So thank you very much, Excellency, for being with us and for these very inspiring words. As you mentioned, the RCEP contains 20 chapters, regulating a range of matters from trade, investment, competitions. In general, we could say that RCEP set the standard for a new level of economic cooperation, integration, and inclusion in the region. Like many FTAs, RCEP incorporates an investment chapter, which is chapter 10, covering a wide range of topics. And I'm sure Dr. Senera and Dr. Elms will cover more of that, including the definition of key terms like investment treatment, protection, promotion, facilitation, and exceptions. The RCEP investment chapter is widely seen as offering an opportunity to consolidate and modernize the investment liberalisation, promotion, facilitation, and protection regimes applicable to all RCEP parties. So as we've heard from His Excellency Sokchenda, the RCEP entered into force earlier this year, in January 1st. And as the negotiations were mostly conducted behind closed doors, the private sector, and in particular investors, are only really starting to understand and fully comprehend the impact that the RCEP may have on future investment decisions. Hence, the timely the time of this dialogue on investment. We've heard from His Excellency Sokchenda that Cambodia has a new non-investment implementation decree are also being prepared. So it's a very timely moment for us to bring this public-private dialogue. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you quickly the objective and the agenda for this event. As you all know, the RCEP is the world's largest trading bloc. 30% of the world GDP is encapsulated among the members. $2.3 trillion of trading goods among RCEP members, 90% tariff on goods eliminated within the bloc, etc., etc. Most of you are aware of the importance of the agreements. What we want to do with this dialogue is to bring you information from government officials, from private sector, from the academy, and from ERIA on some of the key chapters of the events. We have already covered electronic commerce earlier this year, trading goods and rule of origin. We have covered trading services. We are now covering investments, and next month we will cover custom procedures and trade facilitation. So this objective has the following, this webinar has the following objectives. First, for you all to have a good understanding of the RCEP chapter on investment. Second, to appreciate the opportunities created by RCEP, but also by the new law on investment that His Excellency Sokchanda mentioned. And finally, identify capacity information gap and start addressing them. Because what we've been hearing in preparing for this dialogue is that, for instance, chambers of commerce or members of the chambers of commerce are not fully aware of what RCEP is, how they can benefit, where they can get information on the agreement itself. So hopefully these events will trigger some more interest among members of these different associations in Cambodia. We have 3 sessions to cover in the next 2 hours. We have a setting the scene session where we will explain what is RCEP, what is the RCEP investment provisions. We'll have Dr. Deborah Elms, the founder and CEO of the Asian Trade Center, to take us through the investment chapter. And we'll have also Dr. Sar Senera, who is the director of the Department of Legal Affairs and Investment Law at the Council for the Development of Cambodia, to take us through what it means to Cambodia, but also how this new law on investment is really a game changer or an accelerator for attracting FDI into Cambodia. Session 2 will be our usual private sector panel. We have invited 3 president or chairperson of business association in Cambodia. We have Paul Clements, the executive chairperson of the IDC. We have Soros Mekebin, who is the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of France and Cambodia. We have Mr. Kenneth Tang from Ostram, Cambodia. And we have Mr. Harrison White, the CEO of Cambodia Investment Review. Finally, we will ask Mr. Clint O'Connell, who you must be familiar with if you have attended our previous dialogue, to give us a few takeaways from the discussion we had today. So with this, I would like to start the first session, which is on setting the scene. What is the RCEP investment? And what is the investment chapter? What is the law on investment in Cambodia? So for this, I have the pleasure to welcome 2 eminent panelists. I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the founder and the executive director of the Asian Trade Center. The Asian Trade Center works with government and companies to design better trade policies in the region. Dr. Elms is also the president of the Asia Business Trade Association. So Your Excellency, Sokchanda, you were praising the private sector to come in force as part of the participant, but also the speakers. So Dr. Elms is representing also the Asia Business Trade Associations. And we also have Dr. Sar Senera, who was very nicely introduced by His Excellency. Dr. Senera is currently an attorney at law, in tandem with serving as the director of the Legal Affairs and Investment Law Department of the Cambodia Investment Board at the Council for the Development of Cambodia. He was also a member of the Council of Jurists prior, rank equivalent to Under Secretary of State. And Mr. Senera has been very instrumental in a number of legal instrument drafting, the new law on investment, obviously, but also the Cambodia-Korea Free Trade Agreements, the Cambodia-China Free Trade Agreements, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the ASEAN-Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, the China Investment Agreement, and other bilateral investment agreements. So you would all agree with me that with these 2 eminent experts, we are in very good hands to understand what is RCEP, what is the RCEP investment chapter, and how is Cambodia really fit for purpose with this very timely law on investment approved the end of last year, and as Excellency was saying, already creating a lot of noise, positive noise in the region on how to really take advantage and avail of the opportunity created by the neuron investment. With this, I'd like to invite Dr. Deborah Ames to take the floor and take us through the RCEP agreements and the chapter on investment and what it means for businesses, especially in Cambodia. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Let me quickly get my screen shared. And while I am setting this up, let me just say again how delighted I really am that the government of Cambodia, ERIA, and the Australian government have collaborated on this series of workshops. This is, perhaps you're not aware of this, but this is quite unprecedented across the RCEP economies to have this series being rolled out to help businesses use this agreement. And I can't stress enough how critical that is, because otherwise we will have an agreement that has lots of potential benefits and opportunities for companies. But if companies are not aware of it, then they obviously aren't going to take advantage of it. And we've spent 8 years negotiating an agreement that ultimately will change very little. So I am really delighted to see how enthusiastically the government of Cambodia has embraced the RCEP process, as demonstrated in part by this 5-part series to discuss specific elements of concern to businesses in and around Cambodia. So again, my hat is off to all who are involved in this, and thank you again for inviting me. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the provisions in the chapter. Just to remind everybody, we have 15 countries in RCEP, of which 12 are currently active. So it is not enforced for all of the ASEAN members, but China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, Cambodia, and 6 other ASEAN members are part of RCEP already. The agreement is built on existing ASEAN commitments and ASEAN +1 commitments. So a lot of it will look familiar to those of you who are used to using or used to thinking about ASEAN's integration efforts. But there are some important differences. And actually on the sort of good news side, I would say the services and particularly the investment commitments are much more ambitious than ASEAN has done in the past. And I think that is extremely useful and very important, and again, to be commended. But there are, I will note, a lot of exceptions in the text and the schedules. So you'll have to read this chapter very carefully, and I will repeat this a couple times. When needed, please make sure that you consult good legal advice so that you are understanding what the agreement means for your company and that you are using the rules as intended. All of the RCEP texts and schedules are currently available, and you can look at them at your leisure. So let me go through a little bit why states want foreign investment. I think His Excellency did an outstanding job this morning of describing Cambodia's approach to inbound foreign direct investment, where Cambodia from very early days recognized that having inbound investment could deliver significant developmental payoffs. And if you think about what His Excellency said, we had Cambodia in the early 90s without roads and electricity. And if you look around Cambodia today, the situation is dramatically different. And I think it's illustration of how foreign investment combined with the efforts of the local economy can deliver a developmental dividend that is spread across society. I think that's very important. And Cambodia, I think, is a model for how you can use foreign firms as a source of economic expansion and how they can bring in key skills, technologies, experiences that spill over into the domestic economy. So what started as being foreign direct investment reliant development for Cambodia has become part and parcel of Cambodia's own domestic efforts, as I think we will see in just a second, indicated by its investment law regime changes. So there's a lot of good reasons why you want to have inbound foreign investment, and this is true for all of the RCEP participating economies. When you do a trade agreement, there's a couple of things that you want to have that are embedded in that trade agreement that makes it better, more predictable, and easier for investors to participate in the domestic economy. So the first and most important thing is you want to create favorable investment conditions, which means something that's called national treatment for foreign investors. And that says that a foreign investor is not treated differently or discriminated against compared to a local investor. So that first important condition for most trade agreements is to create favorable investment conditions. The second thing that you really want is greater certainty so that an investor is confident that when they invest, they can actually get their money, crucially, but also understand what the rules, the requirements, the regulations, and the policies are. There are, and I'll discuss this in just a moment, there are a number of requirements that governments sometimes put on investment that we call performance requirements. Some of those are unfair and discriminatory. So they're skewed so that foreign investors have a harder time investing than local investors in ways that are discriminatory. And usually in a trade agreement, we want to make sure that any rules that we have are as fair and consistent as possible. We want to make sure that investments are protected, and I'll talk a lot more about this in a moment. And the overall objective of any trade agreement on investment is to have a stronger, more secure, and more predictable environment for investors. And that way you have the conditions on the ground for investors to feel confident in coming in. And so, like every government involved in RCEP, the Cambodian government approached the investment chapter discussions in this agreement as a way to demonstrate Cambodia's commitment now and into the future to support foreign investment and to allow Cambodian companies the opportunity to invest in RCEP economies as well, with that same kind of confidence and predictability. So let me go through briefly some of the elements of this chapter. It is a relatively long chapter, 21 pages in length, and they have 4 pages that describe the definitions. Who is covered, what kinds of investments are covered, what are the elements that are important, how does it relate to other chapters? So they have spent a lot of time in this chapter and in the RCEP negotiations trying to be very specific about what were the commitments in RCEP and then what is it that the governments have committed to deliver to companies. So I think it's very important to review these. The specific member commitments are all shown in what's called Annex 3. So we have, like every part of the agreement, there's a chapter, and then there are specific country commitments, which I'll describe in just a moment. There is a connection between services and investment, where they often overlap. And those of you who were part of the last series that we did on the RCEP agreement for services, you will remember perhaps that we had 2 different approaches for managing services. But the good news is that in investment, all participants, all 15 RCEP countries agreed to use what is called a negative list. So there's only one way in which we have made country-specific commitments. And that way is to say everything is open in investment unless we tell you in our reservations that it is not open for foreign investment. And so I'll go through some of these examples in just a moment. Within those lists in Annex 3, there are 2 categories. And again, I'll describe this a little bit more in a moment. List A is a set of restrictions or reservations that might, keyword is might, change at some point in the future. List B is a set of reservations that are unlikely to be adjusted in the future. Just to let you know up front, there is a bit of a difference. So you can't just read the first ones and skip the second or the reverse. So let me go into some of the details. I won't do this. I won't go across all of the details because there's not enough time. Again, I encourage you please to read the chapter and to seek out advice. We're always happy to support companies and especially trade associations that are looking for help on this. So what happened in RCEP? I gave you some sense of what you want to do. You want to encourage inbound investment. I told you the kinds of things that we normally see. How well then did RCEP members do? Actually, they did quite well. The crucial one is that we have national treatment commitments, which means that RCEP investors, whether they're Cambodian or Singaporean or Japanese, are treated no differently than local investors. And I think that's, again, a critical part of developing that stable, consistent expectations for investment. We also have something called most favored nation, which is if you sign agreement in the future with better benefits, it flows through to current investors, except that Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam have an exception to this rule. And I point this out not to have a long discussion about this particular provision, but just to say, do be cautious when reading this chapter because there are some exceptions, and Cambodia asked for and received some specific exceptions on the investment chapter in RCEP that may be relevant for you. So please, again, do seek legal advice. There is a minimum standard of treatment. Your lawyers will be very excited about that. And then there's a whole long section on expropriation, which again, I will get into in a bit more. And that there is, again, this sort of wide range of exceptions. So I think there's some very good news about what's coming in RCEP, some excellent commitments to open up investment for other RCEP member firms. Remember, this is only investment for RCEP companies. This is not to allow European firms to come in and use RCEP, to allow, you know, some inbound American company to use RCEP, only for RCEP covered investment firms. And again, read the chapter to see how that's defined. You also have transfers without delay. There is a long series of performance requirements that are no longer allowed, and I will talk about those in just a moment. One change that I think may be important for some folks is that some governments in the past have insisted that local nationals serve as senior management. So there's a commitment by government to say, if you're going to invest here, you must have local nationals serve on your senior management. That is now prohibited in RCEP, unless there's some exceptions that you've noted. Directors and boards can still require local nationals as long as it does not harm the investor control of the investment. So there is some changes going on there that I think are very useful. And then the annexes have to be read carefully. One thing I would also note, because when we talk about the advantages that come from an investment commitment, we often have people who are alarmed, I think understandably so, that you have allowed your country as a participant to be subject to inbound investment that could have environmental damage, that could lead to health concerns, et cetera. Please be aware that every government is relatively smart, and governments recognize that they need the right to regulate for health, for environment, for all kinds of public interest reasons. And so it's not the case that the government simply throws up its hands and says, foreign investors can do whatever they like. No, government still has a critically important role of protecting citizens. And that is not changed in the wake of RCEP. So there are new restrictions, or there are new parameters or new rules around this. But government, as always, has the right to regulate to make sure that investments that come in are not unduly damaging domestic citizens. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to say one thing that is extremely useful about RCEP in ASEAN, I think, is a long list of what are called performance requirements that are no longer allowed to be required. In the past, many ASEAN members especially used to do things like, they would say, you can invest in my country, but only if you then export a certain amount or a certain percentage of goods. So you're allowed to have that inbound investment, but only if you agree to export. You're allowed to invest, but only if you have a certain percentage of domestic content that is embedded in that. Now, why is this problematic? Well, it's problematic because the government then is telling the company what needs to be done. And I think this is key, usually there is a non-economic reason for doing this, because investors are pretty savvy and smart as well. And if they think that there is an advantage to be made from exports, invest and then export, they will do so. But what they don't want is to be told by the government that they must export 50% of the content or 75% of the content. And so what RCEP does is it prohibits that. You're allowed to invest. You are not told how much of the investment has to be exported, how much of the investment has to be domestically produced, where the production materials need to come from. You're not allowed to restrict the sales. And as you can see here, there are a number of performance requirements that are now prohibited under RCEP. But there are also two parts of this on transferring technology and on, there's a very long section H on royalties and intellectual property rights, both of which Cambodia received an exemption for on the basis of its developmental status. So there are lots of things that I think are very useful for companies that are a change from past behavior, especially across ASEAN countries. Now, let me show you briefly, what does the country-specific commitment look like? So here I have a sample reservation schedule from Thailand. This is a list A restriction. So that means Thailand is saying you can invest as an RCEP investor Cambodian company coming into Thailand can invest. Schedule A might change in the future. Here is what Thailand is saying. Remember, this is a list of things you cannot do. This is a weird one, but I think it was interesting. So here we go. So in this category of manufacturing, see sector manufacturing, we're talking about playing cards. So, you know, playing cards for poker or whatever, for reasons I don't understand. This is a sensitive issue for Thailand. And what they have done here in their reservation is they have said, we, Thailand, will allow you to invest in Thailand, but if you want to invest in making playing cards, manufacturing playing cards, there are two parts of the RCEP commitments, national treatment and management, that could be a problem that will restrict your ability to do so. And in this case, the next thing down here on description of measure tells you what happens, which is you have to get approval from the general director of the excise department to produce or import playing cards. And the reason we do that is these laws down here. So basically from 1943 onward, for whatever reason, this is highly sensitive in Thailand. They are not changing a 1943 law. If you want to make playing cards, you have to follow these rules. Otherwise, you may not invest in manufacturing playing cards. So this is an example of what a reservation schedule looks like. Some of them are more meaningful than others, but in list A, they tend to be less sensitive and much more narrowly focused playing cards. This is not all manufacturing, it's very specific. So that's very good news because that means that everything else, by and large, is open for RCEP investment. But then we get to the slightly less good news, which is the list B reservation. So let me give you an example of what those look like. And they tend to be much more sweeping and much more challenging for a company to understand. So here is a Thai list B reservation. So in all sectors, okay, that's a big sweeping thing right there, all sectors, at the local level of government, so not federal, not across all of Thailand, but in certain jurisdictions, there is the right to adopt or maintain any measure with respect to an investor or an investment relating to environment, health, or culture. Now that's a fairly sweeping reservation, I think we would all agree, because it means that the local level will decide whether or not this particular investor or investment is related to environment, health, or culture, and they may restrict your ability to do so. So I put this particular reservation here to show you that there is a range of things in this agreement, and it is extremely important if you intend to invest or if you have inbound investment to understand the reservations. Again, these are the restrictions on investment. Generally, very good news, very good consistent rules across how we deal with investment, but in those country-specific schedules can be some challenges depending on what you want to do and how you want to do it. The last thing that I will just mention is another part of investment that matters to investors, which is once I've invested, how do I protect that investment? Now, crucial, I am not talking about in protecting you from all problems. This is not about you losing money. This is not about you poorly managing your investment. It's a very specific problem that we sometimes see happen for foreign investors, which is the government expropriates or seizes your assets without fair compensation. Now the government, let me give you an example, put this in practical terms. You want to open up a bubble tea shop, okay? You make a bubble tea shop. Government says, you know what, actually we want a road that's gonna go right where your bubble tea shop is. Government is entitled to do that. That is a public interest issue. The road is important. They are allowed to take your property back, but they must fairly compensate you for that. So what RCEP does is it says, here are the rules that allow, that define carefully when can you expropriate? What are the rules that allow a government to take an asset? What is the problem, however, is what happens if the government does it anyways? They seize your tea shop and they don't compensate you fairly. Or they say, hey, here's $1 for your tea shop. And you say, well, that's nowhere near the value that we would actually find for this tea shop. An investor can always use the local court system. Just like any domestic investor, you can, as an investor, sue the government for the seizure of your bubble tea shop. The problem for a foreign investor is that if the government has seized the asset, it's not always clear that a local court will look at this favorably on a foreign investor. So typically in a trade agreement, we have a dispute settlement system often called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, that allows a foreign investor to say the rules were not followed. You expropriated and you did not fairly compensate, and therefore I am suing the government. As an investor, I can sue the government. In RCEP, that is not in place. So we have a long section on expropriation, but we do not have the mechanism yet to deal with what happens when the government seizes your asset anyways. In 2 years, so at the end of next year and starting in 2024, there is a commitment to negotiate this mechanism and to have it done within 3 years. So it's coming, this investor protection, but at the moment it is not in RCEP. So I think that's important for people who are investing to know that we have most of what we usually have in a trade agreement, but not this last bit on investment protection. And the last point I will just make is that the lack of this particular kind of protection mechanism does not mean that we don't have any dispute settlement in the agreement. The agreement does have a dispute settlement system for government to government, Cambodia to Thailand, Japan to Singapore. That is still there. What is missing at the moment is this investor to government, government to business investor settlement system. So it's coming, but it's not here yet. And I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to answer questions from you. We have more information at these slides. You will get the slides at the end of this presentation. They will be distributed to everyone. And again, I'm very delighted to be here to share with you the RCEP investment chapter today. Thanks.
Well, Lynn, thank you very much. That's very informative, very information and packed. So thanks a lot. As Debbie mentioned, we are going to share the slides with everyone afterwards. So you don't need to ask that in the chat box. It will be delivered to you as usual. And you may also have the benefit of getting the slides from the previous sessions. With this introduction on RCEP and on the investment chapters, what it does and what it does not contain, I'd like to invite Dr. Sar Senera from CDC, from CIB and CDC here in Cambodia, to maybe share with us his experience of participating as a negotiator on the RCEP, but more importantly, what's the link between what we just heard that is being implemented and the new loan investment that His Excellency Sokshenda mentioned a few times in his introductions. Dr. Senera, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Top about some group Adam Romtrey Sokshenda for Cardiac. How can back to room come to I check the later between some Cardiac and the very good morning to everyone. First and foremost, Excellency Minister Satyana Sapir, Mr. Goji Hachiyama, Chief Operating Officer, Mr. Jeremy Gross, Director of Capacity Building Program of the area, and thanks very much, Mr. Smith, for your moderation. And it's always hard to speak lastly after the first speaker. And I think Dr. Deborah has provided us and has enlightened us with a very comprehensive view and has guided us through very comprehensively on the investment chapter. I couldn't agree more with the substance and the contents of your guidance or your introduction to the investment chapter. However, I think we are on the same page so far as the technicality concerned. So you mentioned that you have touched on the investment facilitation, market access, and also the investment protection. And here I am to inform you with a very moderate slide of my presentation on how you could maximize the RCEP and investment chapters by using our new investment law of Cambodia. I would like to share screen. It's my pleasure to guide you through how investment law of Cambodia complement and realize the spirit of RCEP to attract FDI into Cambodia. And now that you have mentioned that RCEP is well known as a modern, comprehensive, highly quality, liberal and facilitated and comparative multilateral agreement, investment chapter does offer a wide range of the commitments by respective RCEP participating countries which are so promising to the investor, like what Dr. Deborah just informed us earlier, with cautions. And for that reason, may I invite you all to the several aspects of those commitments embraced in several articles of the investment chapter, out of the 18 article and 21 pages, like we just mentioned earlier. So we don't have to go into a very technical, but I just like to pick up some point following what Dr. Deborah just mentioned about the RCEP commitment by the RCEP participating country, including Cambodia. Now, just let me invite you to read what, to go through what here. You talk about the national treatment under the RCEP. The national treatment under the RCEP Article 10.3, it reads that it imposes obligation on the participating country, the obligation to treat those regarded as a foreign investor and their investment not less favorably than that it accord, of course, in like circumstances, to its own investor and their investment with respect to the establishment, acquisitions, expansion, management, conduct, operation, and sale, or other disposition of investment in its territory. And the most favored nation treatment article, which is in Article 10.4, goes even further, and I would like to read to you. Each party shall accord to investor of another party treatment no less favorable than that it accords in like circumstances, again, to investor of any other party or non-party with respect to the establishment, acquisitions, expansion, management, and conduct, operation, and sale or other disposition of investment in its territory. This article imposed obligation on hosting country like Cambodia at various stages of investment. However, what I would like to stress here is the obligation to open or is the market access, which is a core obligation among all. For those who are not familiar with, I would like to inform you that market access that I like to refer here is the permission by hosting country to foreign investor to invest in as many sectors and investment activity as local investor can invest with less restrictions or discriminations between the local investor and foreign investor and amongst the foreign investor. Now let me show you how Cambodia translates this provision into our domestic legislation. I have to reiterate what my minister just mentioned earlier, that the law on investment, new law on investment that comes into force on the 15th October 2021 was at the right time and was in concurrence with our obligation in the RCEP agreement. Now that I would like to inform you that not only that we don't provide different treatment by against the commitment, against the anti-commitment or MEFN commitment in RCEP agreement, but our new investment law is a one-size-fits-all for all investors. What do I mean by this? First, Cambodia law investment is a legislation that applies to all investors and investment in the territory of Cambodia without any discrimination. That means foreign investor and Cambodian investor and their investment are under the same regime. And that's what I have to recall what my minister mentioned earlier, since the first burst of the investment law in 1994. For that, second, I would like to inform you that across the board of the list of investment sectors and activity stipulated in Article 24, as I highlighted in my presentation here, of the law on investment, there isn't any reservation or restriction against foreign investor, either for the market access or the incentive. That what I mean is that whatever investment sector activity that the foreign Cambodian investor can invest in, the foreign investor can also invest in. And the incentive as to be rewarded to those investment projects and activity by the Cambodian investor would also go to the same activity and investment project invested by the foreign investor. It is worth to note that there are several participating countries have reserved their rights That's what Dr. Deborah mentioned earlier by pinpointing to certain country in the region by presenting their reservation list. So many RCEP participating countries have reserved their right to discriminate the foreign investor regarding investment sector, restricted to foreign direct investment, and reserved only for the national investor, like you just pointed out earlier, the playing card production. Those investment sectors are, for example, to name a few, range from the fishery, mining and quarrying, agriculture, manufacturing, or processing of certain agricultural products, such as, in Indonesia, crude vegetable and animal oils are prohibited and reserved only for the local investor. Coconut shell, charcoal, fish processing food from soybean, manufacturing of food processed from soybean or bean, and so on and so forth. Okay, such restrictions range from closing the sector for foreign investor to requiring joint venture with national investor to be eligible to invest and so on. What do I mean? Meaning is that from the outset, the foreign investor could not invest in that certain sector or investment activity because they are preserved for the investor. Or you may be able to invest with subject to the local equity participation. This is what Dr. Deborah really wanted to mention earlier, and that's what I concur her introduction to that. However, Cambodian law has provided here in the provision that I have picked up to show you all here, tells you everything about the market access as regard to the national treatment and most favored nation. And you have to go further. You talk about the prohibition of performance requirements. For the audience, Minister and the audience, I have never met Dr. Deborah in person. It's the first time to see her. So we are on the same page of so long as the RCEP commitment in the investment chapter at the technical level. So we see the same thing. So you mentioned about the prohibition of performance requirement. I agree with you that the RCEP agreement investment chapter prescribes this prohibition of performance requirement, but you also mentioned about the reservation by each participating country. So the prohibition of performance requirement, RCEP participating countries have made a broader commitment that go beyond the WTO terms and which are so promising to the investor, like you mentioned, but with caution. Okay. And as for Cambodia, not only that law on investment does not indicate to require the foreign investor for certain performance, such investment. So we don't require a foreign investor for certain performance, okay, such as to export a given level of percentage of goods, to achieve a given level of percentage of domestic content, to purchase or use or export a present to goods produced in its territory, or to purchase goods from person in its territory. The law on investment instead incentivize the investment project that produce and export. We call export QIP, and also the investment project that utilize the available local content. You may want to refer to this article that I have pointed out in Article 27, which our law provide additional incentive for any project that locally procure the raw material. So my minister mentioned about the IDP 2015-2025. So this is a backward linkage. So to further elaborate, for example, qualified investment project for export to the foreign market, if invested in our country, are entitled to incentive. And another example is that instead of requiring foreign investor to achieve a given or certain level of percentage of domestic content to be qualified to invest in Cambodia, our new law on investment incentivize any QIP that purchase or use local raw material as their production input by exempting VAT, value added tax payment obligation, as additional incentive, if I have to reiterate. Besides the issue of performance requirements, so far as investor is a juridical person, certain RCEP participating country, require that their local resident be appointed as senior management or board of director. Dr. Deborah mentioned about this elimination of this obligation by many countries. But I have to invite you. I couldn't agree more, Dr. Deborah, with your presentation and your guidance. It's what is stipulated in the RCEP investment chapter. However, I have to invite you to go through all the reservation lists of each participating country. For that reason, the Article 10.7 of the RCEP investment chapter is prescribed to prohibit as following. And I have to reread what you just mentioned, what you just guided us through. I read the text for you. Paragraph 1, no party shall require a juridical person of that party that is a covered investment appoint to a senior management position a natural person of any particular nationality. So this is a commitment. Second, a party may require the most of the board of director or any committee, therefore, of a juridical person of that party that is covered investment, be of a particular nationality or resident in its territory of the party, provided that the requirement does not materially impair the ability of the investor to exercise control over the investment. You have already mentioned that earlier. I just like to reiterate. In Cambodia, no performance requirement, but the incentivize. Okay, so this is the article for the reference. So for Cambodia, not only that the law on investment does not prescribe against the obligation, but the law on investment also even went further to incentivize any transfer of skill for the management position. For example, as I mentioned here, the Article 27, I have to read to you, and you can also look into the law later. So the law stipulates that, I read, in addition to the basic incentives set out in Article 26, Article 26 is about the fundamental incentive provided to the qualified investment project. So in addition to the basic incentive set out in Article 26, investment incentive investment activity registered as a qualified investment project receive additional incentive as follows. 1, value added tax exemption, VAT exemption for the purchase of locally made production input for the implementation of the QIP. So this is not the performance requirement for the local content purchase for the market access to investing into Cambodia. But if you really procure and purchase the locally made production input, then you are subject to incentive. This is totally different angle between the imposing the performance requirement and incentivizing. Now that I have showcased you well, our law on investment, so I have just mentioned to you how law on investment, help realize the spirit of the RCEP as regard to the liberalization of the investment regime. I should also share with you how our new law that we can proudly present to you, how our law uphold the spirit of the investment facilitation mandated by the RCEP. So there is no confusion and there is no better time than during the pandemic that our law has been made available. I mean, it's enforced. You see, during the pandemic, the disruption of the supply chain, the interruption and the disruption of the supply chain, and the inability of the movement of the natural person. So the investment facilitation is very, very crucial, as everybody could agree. So meanwhile, the Article 10.15, the investment facilitation under the RCEP investment chapter prescribed, and I read to you, subject to its law and regulation, each party shall endeavor to facilitate investment among the party, including through A, creating the necessary environment for all forms of investment, B, simplifying its procedure for investment application and approval. Here, I would like to give you the point. Cambodia law on investment stipulate provision based on which investment facilitation is not voluntary but obligatory. So the language provided by the RCEP agreement in Article 10.17 is more voluntary and soft language, and it's encouraging the RCEP participating country to facilitate investment. However, the new investment law of Cambodia impose obligation on the authority to do the investment facilitation. If I would, also, and for that obligation imposed on us by the law, and as a result, one-stop mechanism in reviewing the application and registering investment projects is strengthened, and there are more platforms for investment application, and there is an obligation on the authority to provide the aftercare service, which is also the follow-up activity once there is the entry of the investment. To be more specific, the investment application under our new law can be made either through the online or on-site. This is stipulated in Article 10. I show you the slide. So you go to this QIP. You go to click the link. You can go to the link for the investment application. And the reviewing of the investment application and the issuing of the approval or the certificate is now within 20 working days, reduced from 31 working days previously under the previous practice, under the previous law. It's now 20 working days. And I got the data from my colleague at the investment registration department and incentive that to date, since the entry into force of the new investment law on the 15th October 2021, 105 investment projects registered at QIP have been granted the certificate within 20 working days already so far. And what else? Reducing the single registration.
Dr. Sanera, sorry, doctor, I have to intervene. Can you please come to the conclusion, because we are running very late behind schedule. So if you could
I finish
conclude
in 2 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So from 2 certificates now, we have only one single registration certificate, and that certificate is affixed with a barcode or identification number that contains all the preliminary or necessary document for the downstream registration. So this is what the investment law of Cambodia has translated the RCEP, Cambodia's agreement in Cambodia commitment in the RCEP into our domestic legislation, and we are applying the RCEP. Therefore, it's time for the investor to come. And please be reminded that first come, first serve. So you don't have to go and look into all the RCEP agreement as a whole. Just look into the Cambodian law, and you will understand that we are highly committed to serving the investor and realizing the spirit of the RCEP investment chapter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. I hope you can hear me well. It was very informative. Thank you, Dr. Sanera. I have personally learned a lot as well. I knew about the loan investment. I knew about the new incentive, the private sectors, but there's always something new to learn. And I hope everyone, and I'm sure everyone in the room has also learned a lot. There are a few questions in the chat box. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Dr. Sanera and Deborah as well to please have a look at the question in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and I'm going to come back to you later. Or if you want to answer directly in the chat box, that would be very useful. With this, I'd like to move to our next session, where the private sector will have the opportunity to give feedback on what they have just heard, but also maybe ask questions. So Dr. Sanera, please stay with us on the line. One last question to you, Doctor, is whether we can share your 2 slides with the participant, the audience today. Thank you, sir.
For sure.
Thank you. So what I would like to do now, is to go back to our next sessions. And for that, I'm going to share a few slides. So our next session is on the private sector perspectives on the opportunities for FDI in Cambodia. We've heard about the ambitious article on investment in RCEP, or the chapter on investment in RCEP. We've heard about the opportunities created by the new law on investment. What we'd like to hear from the private sector in this second session is whether one, what you have observed with your own investment, but also with what your members are saying, the members of the different associations, confirms what you just heard about the investment climate in Cambodia, but also maybe your own understanding of what RCEP is, because I understand for most of you, RCEP is new, and the content of RCEP are also new. So maybe you could tell us also what you know and what you've learned about RCEP. For this, I have 4 panelists with me today. I have Paul Clements, who is the chairperson of the International Business Chamber of Cambodia, the IBC. I have Mr. Soresme Kebin, who is the chairman of the French Cambodian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, CCIFC. I have Mr. Kenneth Tseng, the president of Oscham Cambodia, and I have Mr. Harrison White, who is the CEO of the Cambodia Investment Review, or CIR in short. So the way we're going to proceed is I have a number of questions to each of the panelists based on what they are doing, also their own investments and their role in the different chambers. And I'm going to give each of you roughly 10 minutes to answer these 2 questions each. And in the meantime, I will also monitor the chat box because I'm sure there will be questions to you. So I'm going to start with you, Paul Clements from the IBC. So Paul, thanks a lot for joining us today. We are very familiar with the work that IBC is doing, in particular, your role in the Government Private Sector Forum that His Excellency Sokchenda was mentioning in supporting the different groups, in supporting the Cambodia Chamber of Commerce, CCC, in its role to be a partner, a dialogue partner with the government. So, Paul, I really have 2 questions for you today, and you have roughly 10 minutes to answer. My first question is how the RCEP investment chapter could change opportunities in Cambodia for your members, for IBC, and how are you planning to avail of this RCEP chapter and of the new law on investments? That's my first questions. And another question may be responding to what His Excellency Sokchenda mentioned earlier. What are the recurrent issues or concerns that you are seeing in terms of the investment climate in Cambodia? Is it access to information? Is it investment promotion? Is it dealing with government partners? What is it that your members are saying? Paul, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the questions, and good morning, Swen. Arun Soste, good morning. Respect to His Excellency Sokchenda, other excellencies of the Royal Government, distinguished panelists, Swen and Jeremy, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, special welcome to overseas guests. And it's an honor and pleasure to be here today, to be involved, to certainly have learnt more today from the other speakers, and also happy to provide feedback on the questions that you've mentioned. You just mentioned briefly one of the roles of IBC, which is to co-chair the government private sector working group on law, tax and governance, so which is really important in terms of dealings with the government on issues like this. And that has been increasing dialogue over recent times. But one of the other mandates of the IBC is very much to promote trade and investment. So the RCEP is a welcomed addition for Cambodia and then from the business community here. That said, IBC represents around about 26 different nationalities and also about equally the same number of industry sectors. So as such, IBC is not necessarily biased between any one nation or industry. But overall, the RCEP is welcomed agreement because it broadens the opportunities for Cambodia across the 15 nations that we mentioned, but also closer to the, closer to Cambodia. I think from a perspective of RCEP, it's a trade agreement which is beyond trade. It covers, as you mentioned before, investments, loans, and other opportunities, and it covers across many borders close to Cambodia. It's very timely as we see increasing interest and investment into Cambodia, but also equally the investment that now is coming out of Cambodia into other countries as well. But unfortunately, it's also important as we start to analyze and assess the potential implications of, we mentioned Europe and also the USA, as they maybe have deteriorating situations and lesser demand. So we need to focus on this particular RCEP agreement in this region for the importance of the reasons we mentioned earlier around for Cambodia. As mentioned, we looked sort of what are the favourable conditions for this arrangement, and we're seeing comparisons between the new investment law and this. So I think it's seen as a very positive. Equally, I think it supports the ongoing control and ownership, which is in line with Cambodia, and also the new investment law that provides that support and comfort to investors. Which, as the Excellency mentioned earlier, it's already been a long-term practice in Cambodia in any case. But it's good to see that the reciprocal rights are starting to increase across the region. So it's for ASEAN, as the Excellency mentioned, ASEAN is the important thing as well. It's a regional bloc, and also how we do that. And I think how I'd like to actually mention, I think where I've identified a really important aspect of this agreement and what's happening in the ASEAN region, we start to see Cambodia becoming very much more part of a multi-country manufacturing supply chain. We've seen that recently with the opening of the Ford assembly plant here in Cambodia, only just recently opened, which was where components are imported from Thailand, assembled here, and vehicles produced, new vehicles. We see that happening in many other sectors historically with the garment sector, and ongoing increase in new sectors like electronics and etc. So RCEP really supports this and brings Cambodia as very much part of that global regional supply chain. So I think that's important. From an IBC perspective, we wish to communicate this to our members. What are the benefits? What are the exceptions, which have just been mentioned? I think that is equally very important. We actually understand that and communicate that to our members. And as you mentioned before, who to contact, where do we seek advice, how do we answer questions? And answering the questions not just through the government private sector working group. His Excellency Sokchenda came to the IBC and members and engaged and communicated with us about the new investment law. And he took questions and the feedback at that time as well. So, it just goes to also demonstrate the open government, and also, the interest, as we see in the passion today from the government side about Cambodia and having further investment in Cambodia, which has always been my experience. I think given the complex nature of the trade agreement, or this agreement and other agreements, the IBC is also seeking support from various parties to have a very simple referral matrix and how we actually understand all the trade agreements and implications. It's not just one agreement or things. As we know, we have bilateral agreements and everything else. So companies get confused, which is the best angle to go through. But certainly RCEP is a standard above others because it's broader in many aspects. The IBC has also instigated a trade supply chain working group, which again covers many parties from different nations and industries, making sure we look at both the opportunities and also the issues that need to be addressed for Cambodia. And I think your second question sort of covers some of the things which we'll get to. More importantly, I think we look to connect parties who wish to invest in Cambodia, existing parties in Cambodia, and also new ones who are reaching out to find out more about the Cambodian environment for advice and referrals. IBC works very closely with the other national chambers. We have what's called the International Chamber Forum, which involves all the other national chambers, Eurocham, AmCham, OzCham, and also the Japanese Business Association. So we have a very broad input in terms of communication and input back through IBC and communication of the voice to the government. I think also what I noticed about the RCEP is that not only is it trying to promote Cambodia and the interaction with other countries in the bloc, but it also highlights, we can highlight the favourable rules around origination or origin for Cambodia as well. So I think we need to explore that and promote that a little bit further as well as part of the communication. We naturally discuss challenges through the working groups, through the government sector, private sector forum, which exists in Cambodia, and the solutions. And as I said before, I'm happy as we continue to take those issues and challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities is what we're all looking for to develop and grow and employ more people in Cambodia. Your question around about what are some of the investment climate challenges? I must say, Cambodia's come a long way since peace, and in the last 14 years that I've been involved with Cambodia, I've seen dramatic change, significant change in professionalism, transparency, infrastructure build, clarity of laws, and most importantly, engagement and communication with the government. Is completely different and a new generation. So, and we're seeing the evidence of that today. I think the old chestnut one is, for most people, is around tax. We've seen tax issues. Some of them have been, and they will continue to happen, right? Because people, the world gets more complex. We're seeing new things come in terms of e-commerce, etc. But again, we have, through the government private sector working group or forum of discussion, engagement, and recently the private sector working group D, which is law, tax and governance, resolved about 8 tax issues that have been outstanding for some time. So again, a very positive step to give clarity, and that is because clarity around the investment law, and that's driving that, is making sure we do give clarity, because we don't want miscommunication or frustration. Naturally, the HR skills have been an issue in the past. Again, it's addressed. The education system here is improving dramatically. It does go vary between industry and industry. Again, there's a number of forums that are part of. The IBC has a working group. Is also working with the World Economic Forum with regard to closing skill gaps. So we're identifying that sort of a co-working relationship with the government as well. So we're addressing what are the easy wins, what are also the more sort of structural changes that require to improve in Cambodia. I think one of the things you mentioned earlier was around governance. I guess it's not just put all the pressure back onto the government. Governance is a big issue for the private sector in terms of also adding confidence around investment. So the private sector is also working now to establish a corporate directors institute to maintain in terms of professionalism and accreditation and ongoing learning around Cambodia and everything else. So putting responsibility back on the private sector at the highest level around governorship and everything else. So the IBC and the other chambers are working to establish that institute. I think when we talk about some government processes, there's been massive changes in terms of government process with the new single window of registration of companies, making it easier. And it's all electronic. There's also payments by electronics, so that it is moving in the right directions of that. There's probably still some small frustrations, and we're slowly raising those back through forums to the government to identify those frustrations. But that's more administrative and causing a bit of angst. But and that's what people hear about when you have a bit of frustration and angst. That's where people complain. But overall, as we raise these issues, they are slowly but surely getting addressed. There's the natural issues that I think we're facing around electricity costs and also around fuel costs, but I think that's a sort of a global phenomenon now. But that's important, and logistics, and I think that is something which again we're trying to address in the supply chain. So it's actually interesting now that because of COVID and people coming out of COVID, the communication within the private sector and the coordination in the private sector across association and chambers is getting there. So we're providing more knowledge, more examples, and working with the government on these issues. And I think that with the new investment law, with the new RCEP that's come out, I think that gives us a mechanism for further improvement and drive to work collaboratively together. So there's some of the issues, I think, but I think the bigger ones really we're focusing on now is really around the human resources skills and identifying how we build areas where Cambodia is now starting to focus its future investment on. Thanks, Sven.
Thank you, Paul. I think it's very reassuring to hear that at least there's knowledge on RCEP and on the new loan investments, and that has been mainstream into the work that you are doing with the private sector working group. Very good to hear that, and hopefully this type of event, but also other events that we're planning to organize in the near future, will also boost the interest of businesses in at least learning more from CDC, CIB, or from the business chambers on what RCEP is, what are the opportunities. So thank you, Paul, for joining. Please stay with us. We may have a few other questions coming to you later on. I would like now to invite Sorosmei Kevin, who is the president of the French Cambodian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Sorosmei, thank you for joining us. I understand you are now in France, so it's 5:40 in the morning for you, very early. We are glad that you accepted our invitation to join. And one of the reasons why I insisted on having you representing the French business community, it's because not long ago, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, you organized or you helped to organize with the French community the French Cambodian Business Week, I think you call that. We had a lot of investors coming to Cambodia and explore the market and hopefully be ready to invest. So similar to what I asked Paul, 2 questions to you is, are your members in the French chamber aware of RCEP, of the opportunities created by RCEP, especially on the investment chapter? Are they asking you for information or what the opportunities are? And my second question is related to this business week you've just organized with this number of French investors, and I understand from other countries coming to Cambodia. What did they tell you about the investment climate that they're seeing here in Cambodia? So thank you, Rasmei, for joining us. The floor is yours. You have roughly 10 minutes.
And thank you, Sven, and good morning, everyone. Sorry if my voice is a bit weak, but it's quite early morning. So I will say I won't add much more to what Paul said about the investment climate in Cambodia. As a Chamber of Commerce, let's say we have 2 duties. The first one will be toward our members. The company is already established in Cambodia. And then the second duty we have is also how to attract more French companies entering the Cambodian market. So I will say the RCEP is a very welcome addition to the new investment law and to, let's say, what the royal government of Cambodia has already been doing in Cambodia for the foreign investors. It's quite a complete agreement, and I have to admit myself that I don't know the full extent of it, and I'm very happy that I learned a lot of things today. I do believe that it does create more opportunities for the French companies already established here, and we do have on our side, we do have more than 150 companies with us, and we believe that there is around 400 or 500 French companies established in the Cambodian market already. And then we do hope that it will help us attract more companies entering the market. That said, I will say we do not have much technical question from the local company about this agreement. I do believe we need to do more dissemination work with the other Chamber of Commerce, with Eurocham, with IBC as well. There is much more to do about it so that our members are more aware of the opportunities coming with RCEP, and notably that it could help us, it could help them, invest in neighbor countries as well. But we had quite a lot of questions, not specifically of this agreement, but of course of the investment climate in Cambodia. And when we did organize this French Cambodian Business Forum, so it was 3 weeks ago, we had more than 100 French companies coming from France first, but also from all the countries in the area: Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar. The first step for us was really to convince them to come. And it has been something we have been working on for more than 4 months. And I would say having 100 companies coming was already a success. And then the question is, when they are coming to Cambodia, what we can show them in only 2 days. We did not want something very, very technical, because most of the time those people were it was their first time in Cambodia. So the idea was really for us, first I told to introduce them to our partners as the Royal Government of Cambodia. And I would like to really thank His Excellency Sokchenda Sopir for the very warm welcome he offered to this delegation. It was very, very appreciated. I would say that I got a lot of feedback that they all said that it was the first time for them to have such welcome from a governmental entity. It was very important for us also to show them the full extent of Cambodia. So we choose to organize this event in at least I will say 7 or 8 locations, so that they had a full vision of what's happening in Cambodia. We did mobilize a lot the local ecosystem, because we had more than 30 conferences, talk, roundtable about with French and French Cambodian local entrepreneurs, local company owners, or managing some corporation, sharing their own experience about Cambodia. So I would say overall it was a mix between showing them the opportunities of the Cambodian market, let's say the legal structure of it, and what is coming with the new law of investment, and also the RCEP. But more important was to show them that Cambodia is a market and is a country that knows how to welcome investors and new company owners. So some of them will just enter the market because Cambodia is now a very interesting market for them. This is more for companies already established in Thailand, Vietnam, for example, and Cambodia is just their next door market. So they are just coming to sell, I will say, their product and their services. But also some of them are looking to establish their basis in Cambodia in order first to tap into this Cambodian market, but then later on to maybe enter also Vietnamese market, Thailand market, and Laos market. And this is, I believe, where this agreement is very, very important. So that said, if any question, please shoot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rasmei. It's very reassuring to hear that in this initiative, you involved the government and the public sector. Not only you involve them, but as you've heard from you, CDC through the SNC Sokchenda support is also very proactive in this. We keep seeing from the time I was working at the WTO, from the RCEP and the Asean, that Cambodia is pro-business, is pro-trade. But what you've just described is a way to demonstrate that, to practice what we preach, and that yes, Cambodia is pro-business, is pro-trade, come and see and invest, and then expand, use Cambodia as a basis to expand in the region. And hopefully the loan investment will be a catalyst, a booster to do that. So Rasmei, thanks again for joining us that early in the morning. You earn your breakfast. Please stay with us if you can, in case we have a few questions. And I keep hearing from Paul and from you the importance of also working across chambers, because this information on RCEP or on the new law investment is actually useful for everyone, not only for the members of this or that chamber. So I'll come back to that point later. So thank you again, Rasmei, for joining us this morning. And I'm turning now to Kenneth Hong. who is the president of Asean Cambodia, as well as the managing director of Dynamic Group. If you've been in our event earlier, Kenneth makes a regular occurrence and appearances in our event. So thank you, Kenneth, for joining us again today. Mostly today as the president of Asean. So I'll ask some similar questions to what I asked Paul and Rasmay. Is it, first of all, do you see a growing interest among your members in free trade agreements in general, but more specifically on RCEP, especially considering Australia is a member of RCEP? Do you think this will trigger more interest from Australia into investing in Cambodia? This is my first question. My second question is, you were very instrumental in this high-level roundtable that was organized in April between the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the CDC. And as I can see, Unvon Ra, Deputy Secretary General of CDC, was co-presiding this event. Can you tell us a bit more about what was said at this event? Do you see this as a trigger to attract more investors? What is being done to attract more Australian investors into Cambodia? So thank you, Ken, for joining us. And Florios, you have 10 minutes as well.
Thank you, Sven. Good morning to everyone, Your Excellencies, and distinguished panelists and other guests. Thank you so much. It's always nice to be here and have a conversation with everyone. I understand that we're a bit time poor, so a lot of things I wanted to discuss, Paul and Rasmay has probably already covered. So I'll try and be brief. My feeling, and this is just observation and from what I know, is that there is definitely interest in investing in Cambodia, particularly with the advent of the RCEP agreement. There was a lot of people that I've been speaking to recently that haven't been able to travel to Cambodia for the last 2 years or more. So these are now starting to come back, and it obviously helps that there is free travel between Australia and Cambodia. There's no quarantine. It's an ideal way to reignite interest within Cambodia. So absolutely yes, and I foresee that number to increase in the coming weeks and months as I hear people are coming back. And I think that's some of the tentative activity before is that, when you're not on the ground, it's difficult to make any investment decisions. And now that these barriers to entry have been removed, I'll definitely feel a lot more optimistic from Australian investors. I think the second part of the question is, the roundtable event. I think that was a great event between government and the Cambodian CDC and all the relevant ministries that would facilitate business investment. Some of the quick summaries is that a lot of Australian investors talked about their concerns, what have been their experiences investing in Australia, from Australia to Cambodia. And it was in a forum that was open conversation, and I think that was very, very constructive. The big takeaway for me was there was nothing really serious. It's more like ironing out little issues such as, we talked about setting up a company here with a certain amount of share capital. They were talking about clarity in relation to tax. And I think all those were adequately addressed at the roundtable. And I think that it sort of provides a platform for future dialogue between government and private companies or investors. And I certainly look forward to the next round of roundtable discussions as well. In terms of what are we doing and what are we seeing from Australian Chamber of Commerce? Well, first, I think we had a few high-level meetings as well, like the Secretary of Department of Foreign Affairs was in town fairly recently. The Senior Trade Commissioner for Austrade was also in town about 2 months ago. So what we're trying to do is reignite and restart the idea of doing business and investing in Cambodia. So one of the things that we've had discussions with DFAT, just to keep it short, is that we would like an Austrade office here in Cambodia. Austrade is currently run out of Vietnam, and I think it's certainly about time that we have a representative of Austrade being based in Cambodia to facilitate and assist Australian investors who are looking to come to Cambodia. And I think that's been missing for many, many years. I believe that's work in progress. But the feedback from the Secretary was they will definitely look at it. I think what else can we do to improve? I mean, there's very little investment from Australia at the moment. Is that a lot of benefits from Cambodia are actually not really known. I'll talk about a very quick story. Is that when I was growing up in Australia, a lot of people asked me, you know, where's my family from? And I would say, yeah, my family's from Cambodia. And a lot of people didn't even know where Cambodia was. So the fact that we don't sort of register on people's minds means that we probably could improve the way we brand Cambodia and how do we market Cambodia as a place to invest. And I would summarize the key points just where I feel is that with the advent of the new law of investment, we talked about the low barriers of entry. It's quite easy to set up a company with a single window. We can actually have a simple process of applying for visas and all the relevant working documents. I think that's fairly straightforward. And I think the relative cost of labor here is still quite attractive from an investor's point of view. So I think if we can improve the branding and marketing of investing in Cambodia, and we will look for assistance from DFAT again. So one of the things I've talked about with them is that maybe having a business guide on how to do business in Cambodia for Australian investors, and potentially look at some funding of events like a field trip for Australian investors to come to Cambodia, have a look what's on the ground, introduce them to other Australian investors. How do we share our experiences and knowledge, and how do we create a path and a shortcut to investing in Cambodia? And I think one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that Australia is quite an important aid partner in Cambodia. So there's several funds. There's the Australian Mekong Strategic Partnership. That's roughly worth about $200 million over several years. There's a new program called the Cap Red, and that's going to be somewhere between 5 and 8 years of another funding. And of course, there's other, I guess, regional funds as well, like Partnership for Infrastructure. That's a $450 million fund for the region. And there's other, smart city funds like scattered around the region as well. So Australia is very active in Cambodia and this region. And it's just something that we need to tell investors that there is potential business for them as well from that funding. So that's how I'd like to close, so that we could just do a lot more branding and marketing for Australian investors. And I think particularly with the RCEP, there's going to be major benefits in regards to garment manufacturing and other sort of manufacturing in the form of reduced tariffs. So I hope that can be, I guess, productively and clearly addressed and shared with Australian investors.
Thank you again, and thank you for sharing these takeaways from the Investment Roundtable. I was fortunate to be moderating this roundtable, and one of the message that we kept hearing during the roundtable was that it's important to attract new investors, but it's also important to take care of the existing investors in Cambodia, because what we've heard during the roundtable is that I would say 95% of them were ready to invest more in Cambodia. So they are the best agents of change. They can talk to government here, but they can also talk to investors back in Australia. And very happy to confirm that we are developing this handbook on investing in Cambodia using the Australian experience and the information provided by CDC and CIB to make sure that we have a really accurate and timely handbook, because it will be using the information from the CIB on the loan investment. So thank you again, Ken, for joining us, for sharing your candid views on Australian investment and the investment climate here in Cambodia. I'd like now to invite yet another Australian, but that's a pure coincidence. This is Harrison White. Harrison is the founder and the CEO of the CIR, Cambodia Investment Review, online media in Cambodia. And the reason why we are inviting Harrison here is, first of all, because Harrison has been covering all our events so far and has been promoting not only the event, but also RCEP implementation in Cambodia. But also, if you're familiar with CIR, there are a number of articles, very nicely researched articles on RCEP, on Asean, on the WTO, and their impact for Cambodian businesses. So the reason why I wanted to have Harrison with us today is to tell us more about what do you feel people and businesses and government know or understand of RCEP. I see you have a number of articles recently on RCEP, on different chapters on RCEP. Do you feel the knowledge is there? Do you think more could be done in improving the access to information for businesses on RCEP? What would be the recommendation for you as a keen observer of the business environment in Cambodia on how to improve knowledge and I mean, obviously, usage of the RCEP contents? Thank you, Harrison, for joining us. Over to you. You also have roughly 10 minutes.
Thank you, Sven, for those very kind words. I think that's a very apt way to describe CIR. And thank you very much and welcome distinguished guests and my fine panelists for having us on. I also understand we're a bit pushed for time, so I'm going to keep my answers concise. From our experience of must have been speaking to over hundreds of investors, foreign, local, in all honesty, free trade agreements and new tax laws or incentives are not always on the top of their list. What we do find is are those mostly based as an incentive ongoing. So when we do speak to people, we don't find yet that these are major reasons for attracting people. What we understand is that if the business is viable or if the return on investment is applicable in Cambodia, this is what drives people to come here. So what we need to do more of is understand once the business is actually viable in Cambodia or an investment has a return on their investment, how can we use these laws to better bring more people here? What we also have been speaking to a lot of people about is that these are should not be seen as silver bullets to concerns that any foreign investors have. We understand people love to talk about free trade agreements and new tax laws or new law on investments, for example. But sometimes these things can be a little bit overtaken of what are still the core issues or what are still the core concerns around investing in Cambodia. So that would be my first point of the question. Now, the second question coming into what can be done to increase the appeal or understanding of Cambodia as an investment destination. I think we must spend about 20 hours a week speaking to people on this one question. And what I have found is that the three main points that we can do as a private sector and also working with the public sector, such as the CDC or the Australian, international, French business chambers or embassies, is very important. In all fairness, especially coming from an Australian point of view, some of this we have to work against some of the NGO branding of Cambodia that has been done over the past 20 years. So we really have to almost switch what we're trying to sell. Now, the top 3 points. First would be promoting more role models and mentors. I think it was His Excellency Sok Chenda who spoke at the Indonesian Investors Summit earlier this year and said you could have government ministers or talking about how fantastic a new law on investment is or about free trade agreements. But what most Australian, French, US, they want to see is someone from their country coming to Cambodia and making a success. So I think it's super important to continue promoting these role models and also then offering mentorships. So when people do want to invest here, they have a phone number and someone who answers the phone is one of us who can speak to them frankly and honestly. And that also goes vice versa. While we can speak very positively, if someone's had a negative experience and they speak negatively, that's actually 10 times worse to trying to bring people here. So we have to make sure that the investors here are having a good experience and will promote back to Australia. Now, the second point I'd like to mention would be removing barriers. Another fantastic line I heard, which was at the Australian Roundtable, was that FDI is like water. It follows the path of least resistance. So if we're trying to increase foreign direct investment here, we need to remove as many barriers as possible. Now, today's probably not the best forum to go through all those barriers and the solutions attached. I'm sure we can have a chat about that later, but making things as simple as possible for any investor is really the priority. And it's a major reason why you're seeing people from, taking advantage of RCEP and, moving, for example, from Myanmar to Cambodia. This is why some of the exports are increasing, because the barriers to entry in Cambodia are much less than other countries. So it's important to continue that. And I think thirdly, and this is probably a few things we've touched before, a few of the other speakers have touched on, but I just want to reiterate it because it is the most important, is continuing to nurture and increase the investors already here. So many people keep putting, any business person knows that increasing the sales to your current clients is much more economical than trying to attract new ones. It's just the amount of times people who we have to firstly explain where is Cambodia on the map. Taking someone from that point to then actually spending their money to invest here can be done, but it's cost a lot of money and it's going to take a lot of resources. There are people here who want to continue investment. So I believe that while it's all fantastic to try and attract new investors to Cambodia, let's work on the ones already here. And I was having a look at the people involved in the webinar today, and a lot of these people are already in Cambodia. A lot of these people already have ties here, already have investments here. So I really want to implore this one back to any takeaway from my 10 minutes today is that we need to continue helping the investors already here whilst bringing new ones in. So I think I'll just like to leave on that main point for today. And just thank you everyone so much again. And this is a fantastic initiative that's been done. And I really look forward to the future ones as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harrison. I think you're confirming some of the earlier points made by Paul, by Ken, and Rasmay on using the investors already here, their experience. They are the best agents to speak about Cambodia, in addition to what the government is doing in terms of investment promotion and investor targeting. I think it's one of the key takeaways that I'm taking from these panel discussions. I'm also interested in hearing from you all that there is room to collaborate. There is room to collaborate because when we started this dialogue together with ERIA and DFAT, we were not sure how to approach the private sector. But more and more we realized that talking to individual investors is one thing, but talking to you and for you to get together or arrange activities together where you can have much higher numbers of participants might be the way to go in the future, so that we can reach out to more investors in Cambodia and outside. But I'm not very good at summarizing and at doing takeaways for workshops and seminars. And luckily for me and for ERIA and for you all, we have Clint. We have Clint O'Connell, who you may be familiar with because in past dialogue, Clint was actually the one introducing the different chapters and what they mean for Cambodia. So with this, I'm going to move us to the last session of today before the closing remarks. And this last session is on the takeaways from the workshop. However, before I do that, I'd like to thank Paul, Rasmay, Kenneth, and Harrison for coming and staying with us during this panel and for sharing your knowledge and the candid information and candid views you have on investing in Cambodia. So thank you for the four of you. So our next session will be what we call either takeaways, what are the key considerations for a continued public-private dialogue on investment in RCEP. And for this, we have invited Clint O'Connell, who is the head of the Cambodia tax practice and the Cambodia Deputy Managing Director at DFDL here, DFDL Law Group in Cambodia. Clint, thank you for joining us. I see that you have taken a lot of notes. You paid attention to everything we've said. from the beginning, we're very happy to have you back in this series. So can you share with us what you have learned, and I guess what our participants have learned today about the RCEP chapter on investment, the favorable investment climate in Cambodia, which has been triggered by a number of reforms in progress and revolutions, quoting His Excellency Sok Chenda, in the business environment in Cambodia, and what could we do better, and not only for the government, for the private sector, but also for us at ERIA in terms of promoting these RCEP and other free trade agreements. Thank you, Clint. Over to you.
Thank you, Swen, and good morning, Your Excellency. Good morning, distinguished panelists and distinguished guests. So it's quite a large topic, but I'll try to summarize it as well as I can. Firstly, I would like to recap His Excellency's opening remarks, which I thought were particularly important and relevant for those of us who have been here for some time, and also for those who are new to Cambodia, to provide some context as to where we are today with respect to the implementation of RCEP, and also with respect to the implementation of the recently promulgated law on investment in Cambodia. As His Excellency mentioned, back in the 1990s, Cambodia post-war needed FDI to build infrastructure, to build the domestic economy. And the very basis of what His Excellency was saying, and some of the key points that I took away, was the need to have openness for FDI, the need to integrate into both Asean economy and also the global economy. This issue around multilateralism was also enforced by His Excellency. One thing I can say from my own experience, and the point that His Excellency raised, was the willingness of the Cambodian royal government to listen to the private sector in Cambodia, to listen to the concerns of investors and also those associations that represent them. And this could be no better seen than the recent law on investment, where the private sector had many opportunities to have an open dialogue with the royal government of Cambodia. I remember meeting His Excellency and Dr. Senara at the Council for the Development of Cambodia. We were able to give the feedback of the private sector, to provide our suggestions and recommendations to the royal government. And a lot of these were ultimately incorporated into the law of investment as we see it today. Also taking note, Your Excellency, of the key milestones of Cambodia through the 1990s and early 2000s with respect to the Asean Asean WTO, which basically have brought us to where we are today. Moving on to the discussions of the two doctors, Dr. Deborah, very insightful context of the RCEP chapter. I must admit, Doctor, when you were talking through the RCEP chapter, I was thinking to myself, Cambodia has already, and Dr. Senara enforced this, Cambodia has already implemented a number of these incentives, shall we say, whether it's the national treatment for foreign investors, the greater certainty with respect to transfer of capital and profits, the stronger protection of investments. We can see in the law on investment, which Dr. Senara went through, we have an entire chapter which is based on investment guarantees and protection. We also have, which I think was not mentioned, but is also very important, a dispute resolution article in the law on investment as well, which is something which I believe is also discussed under the RCEP investment chapter. So thank you, Deborah. That was a very insightful discussion that you gave to us. My good friend, Dr. Senara, basically made the point, which I think is a very pertinent point, that the law on investment, as it was enacted last year, has already incorporated a number of the aspects which RCEP guarantees to foreign investors. And the point made about the activities covered under the law on investment being open to not just local companies in Cambodia, local producers, but to foreign investors as well. The application of the incentives under the law on investment also being spread evenly or the same equitably amongst foreign investors and local enterprises. I guess what I'd like to end up with is that I guess a few questions and maybe a few recommendations for the royal government to consider. One of the key areas that we get feedback from a number of investors is with respect to double tax agreements. So I note that Cambodia has done extremely well in the last few years with broadening its double tax agreement base with a number of jurisdictions. I think at last count, it's around 11 double tax agreements. It would be great to see those that treaty network expanded to all of the members of RCEP, including Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, because in our experience, the tax treaties tend to go hand in hand with foreign investors looking to invest in Cambodia, particularly when it comes to issues such as profit repatriation or interjurisdictional transactions around royalties and interest and dividends. So I assume, Your Excellency, that this is probably already on the agenda, but just as another word of encouragement, if we could look to see that treaty network further extended, that would be great. And I think, Your Excellency, you may have been asked this question a number of times, so I'll need to ask it again, and I apologize if it sounds repetitive. On behalf of the private sector, we are all very keenly awaiting the enactment of the sub-decree to implement the new law on investment. So it would be remiss of me to not take this opportunity to ask you if there's any progress on that front and if there's any update that you can share with us today. So that's where I'll end it. Sven, I'd like to thank again all of the speakers. It was a very educational session for me. I learned a lot, and I hope that others have learned a lot also. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. Yeah, I remember now why I asked you to do these takeaways, because they're always excellent. So thank you very much, Clint. I could not agree more with what you've just mentioned. And ending with this question to His Excellency Sokchenda, who we are going to give the floor to in a short while. With this, I'd like to conclude this third session. Thank you again, Clint, and thank you all our panelists for coming here, sharing your knowledge. Hopefully, you'll join us again for the next event. Should be the third week of July, PPD number 5 on customs procedures and trade facilitations chapter of the RCEP agreement. With this, I'd like to thank you all and for bearing with me and bearing with the slight delay. And I'm happy to give the floor back to Jeremy for the conclusion of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. Sven has already thanked all the speakers and panelists for their insightful contributions today. But can I also extend my thanks to Sven for his excellent moderation and organization of these panels. So thank you, Sven. Clint, in his summary just now, it was interesting to note how it drew on actually some of the comments that His Excellency Sokchenda Sophia made in his opening comments about the history, noting the importance of investment for development and openness and developing the economy. There were a couple of questions that Clint posed in his summary, his closing comments. And of course, now I will be handing the floor to His Excellency Sokchenda Sophia to deliver his opening comments and conclusions from today's discussion. So Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Gross. I will be brief. First, I would like to thank Clint for his excellent summary. I don't have to say anything else because he has done the job already. For this excellent job, he deserves answer to his question. He raised two questions. The first one, it was about the agreement on avoidance of double taxation. I totally understand that whenever there are bilateral or multilateral investment agreement, along that, we should have avoidance of double taxation agreement. Just, and you know well, the FDL know well, before we didn't have any such agreement. Then, as a priority, because again, we want to be a good member of the ASEAN family, we start by negotiating those agreements on the avoidance of double taxation with ASEAN members. This was the first step. Then we move to those countries with whom we have signed bilateral investment treaties. This was the rationale. And very rightly, as you point out, and I will, after this meeting, call my colleague from the General Tax Department to tell him that look at the list of RCEP members and do the job with your colleague with whom we didn't negotiate and sign yet. First answer. Second answer, enactment of the implementing sub-decree. Very, what I say, legitimate requests or questions. I wish to tell you that CDC has drafted already, and we have sent it to the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And I saw recently a post in their Facebook. The ministry is working actively on our draft. Forgive us for taking a bit time, but as you know, it deals with revenue. This is an important matter, tax revenue. Incentive is about not collecting tax. And let's be positive. The private sector has waited for a while for the law on investment. But at the end, after years of waiting, what we get, you would agree, is a nice baby. So give us a bit time in order to prepare for you and for the sake of further economic development of Cambodia, a sub-decree that is up to date, that better than this would be able to help us weather the storm. You see, the law on investment, CDC has finalized it by end of 2019. Fortunately, we didn't have the cabinet approval. Fortunately, we didn't adopt it before COVID, because with the disruption that COVID brought, though that law would not be relevant. So I would never say thanks to COVID, but because of COVID, we have been revisiting our draft, and what we get help us really to adjust to the new normal. In this period that I seek your understanding and patience, and because we wish the implementing sub-decree to follow the same path to help us moving. And it's about the topic of today's about providing a legal environment that will bring further investment to Cambodia. I thank you for your attention.
His Excellency Sokchenda Sophia, thank you on behalf of all attendees at this public-private dialogue for your direct and candid responses. I'm sure everyone will be very pleased to know that things are in place, that there will be pushing forward with the idea of the taxation treaties, as well as having an update about the sub-decree. May we also thank you once again for your participation, honoring us today with your presence. This is obviously a first conversation, a first public-private dialogue. It's not going to be the last, but I hope today's discussion has helped raise issues of concern. It's also heard many positive things, which are so important to ensure that the environment is positive for future investment in Cambodia. And on behalf of ERIA, we would certainly like to be here to support the process of making RCEP a success. On that, may I thank once again, not only His Excellency and the Council for the Development of Cambodia, all the panelists, all the speakers for your participation today, and of course, all the attendees watching in. I really hope it has stimulated ideas about how we can move forward together. So on that, I would like to close the meeting. Thank you, everyone.